So there's a lot going on in the news at the moment. It's difficult actually to decide what to cover. There is a lot of news here. I've got today's newspaper, and I'm going to be talking about Ukraine in this video, but just briefly, because it's pretty violent. There's been uh, an act of violence in the Democratic Republic of Congo, for want of a better term. And even by DRC standards, this is pretty bad. Attempted jailbreak leaves at least 129 people dead. I'm just going to mention this briefly because it's, one of those parts of the world that just isn't going to get the same attention as others. The reports by John Eves Kamala, um, an attempted jailbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo's main prison left at least 129 people dead, officials said yesterday. A provisional assessment showed that 24 inmates were shot dead by warning gunshots as they tried to escape from the overcrowded Makala Central Prison in Kinshasa on Monday, said the Interior Minister Yaquimene Shabani. This prison apparently has capacity for 1,500 people, has currently 12,000 inmates, um, many of whom are awaiting trial according to Amnesty International. It's so overcrowded that inmates often die from starvation, the activist group said. Yeah, that's a pretty grim place. Sticking with Africa, there was also an atrocity in Burkina Faso by Islamists, up to 400 people killed. Appalling figures, but it just doesn't seem to get the same traction as, for example, the Middle East or Ukraine. So I'm just putting it out there to, I guess, spread the knowledge. But that's the report on the Kinshasa prison violence. Anyway, to get on to the subject of this video, the main subject, Ukraine. Um, there was an atrocity yesterday, yet another atrocity by Russia on the city of Poltava. 51 people killed, dozens more injured. Now, the target was apparently a military academy, so Russia and Russia's supporters are going to say it was a legitimate target. But there's a hospital next to it. And, when we're talking about military academy, we're going to be talking about teenage boys. Um, this is how unquestionably state terrorism, to strike into a civilian, into a city in that way. And it really isn't surprising given Russia's track record, given what Russia's previously done at Bucha, Mariupol, Kramatorsk, and elsewhere. And it just shows this war is very, very far from scaling down. You know that expression, a corner dog is a dangerous one, I think it applies here. Um, I'm not a military strategist, so I don't know how effective this incursion into the Kursk Oblast is, whether it's sensible or not. There is some logic behind it, I think. Um, by going into Russia proper. Of course, remember it's Putin that thinks there should be no borders, so there's some irony in that. He's got what he wanted, arguably. The Russian people have been brainwashed to believe that the Ukrainians are marauding Nazi killers. When people interact with Ukrainian troops there, they're going to see that these troops from another country are not marauding Nazis, and in most cases, they've treated local Russian civilians comparatively well, certainly a hell of a lot better than their counterparts treat Ukrainian civilians. We'll probably get a few outliers where a few rogue Ukrainian troops cross a line. That's wrong. But there's a fundamental difference. Ukraine has standards. Ukraine will hold those people to account. Russia doesn't only not hold them to account, it actively encourages the brutalization and terrorizing of civilians. Um, I think, though, part of the issue is that Russian soldiers are utterly demoralized. I think and this is no excuse, by the way, but I think being a Russian soldier is probably one of the worst jobs in the world. I mean, the way that Russia treats its own soldiers is just appalling. It's really, um, I think it's one of the worst jobs in the world. And as for the casualties, really staggering figures. Even if you take a more conservative figure, it goes into tens of thousands killed and wounded. Um, there was another attack today, 7 killed in another city. Um, But this war is really not a small thing. There's now development of a flamethrower drone that's used, involving thermite, which could get up to 2,000 degrees, used by the Ukrainians against Russian positions. A nuclear plant is involved in Kursk Oblast. So the volatility of this war is really palpable. Um, and then there's the issue of Western support for Ukraine. I think one of the risks here is that there will be Western fatigue of, how can are we supposed to support Ukraine forever kind of thing. I think it is right that allies of Ukraine ask questions and want to establish exactly what weaponry is used for and where and so on. Um, but I also understand Ukrainian frustration at delays because, on one hand, the West has been very supportive. I think Ukraine's lasted as long as it has for two reasons: the courage and resilience of the Ukrainian people and President Zelensky's leadership, but also Western support. Now, if Western countries say we support Ukraine, but we're going to like kind of go halfway there, it's a bit like, I don't know if I can make a loose analogy. Like you see your neighbor's house on fire, and you offer to help put it out, and you put out the fire in say two rooms, but then there's a fire in the third and fourth room, and you think, oh, there's some water in the stream, but we're not going to get that just yet. It's something like that. That's a very loose analogy, but it's kind of like everything or nothing in a sense because the stakes here are so big. Putin's clearly not going to give up. There will be some who are now openly saying, I know in the elections in Germany, for example, um, both the hard left and the hard right are calling for an end of support to Ukraine. It's certainly been the stance of populist leaders in Hungary and Slovakia. Well, I say populist, it's a matter of debate whether that's shared by the public or not. I think most Europeans still understand that Ukraine needs support and there's a vested interest here. And that's the point I would make. This isn't just about Ukraine, although Ukraine is very much on the front line and Ukrainians have suffered more than anyone from Russian state terrorism. This does involve the rest of Europe because this country has had experience. Salisbury, you have ultra-nationalist hacks on Russian television openly calling for nuclear war on Berlin and London. I mean, this is a mentality that's going on in Putin's Russia. And if anything has should have been learned over the last 24 years, it is that Vladimir Putin cannot be trusted. There is those who spin this narrative, oh, well, he's just being provoked. Ha, Nigel Farage, for one. But this narrative that Russia's been surrounded by NATO, Russia's had the lash out. Um, Russia's foreign policy is entirely its own decision, and the mess that Russia is in terms of its relative isolation, I'm not going to say unilateral isolation, but relative isolation, is entirely of Putin's making. I hope that there will be some sort of enlightenment in Kursk Oblast that the Ukrainians are not actually Nazis, but that's only one part of a massive country. Um, I know that there is. I'm just looking at this report about the visit to Mongolia. Putin visited Ulaanbaatar yesterday and met his counterpart. I'm going to try and pronounce this correctly. Uknagin Kurilsuk, probably saying that wrong, the Mongolian leader. He arrived in a yurt. Mongolia has good relations with the West, broadly speaking, but it also has relations with Russia, a little bit like India. And, Mongolia has failed in its international obligations. Mongolia is a member of the ICC, so it's treaty bound to arrest Putin. Some are theorizing that Putin himself didn't go there, that he's a body double. I don't know about that. Um, I think he's arrogant enough to have went himself. But, Mongolia has failed. They are treaty bound to have arrested him. When he was going to visit South Africa last year, again, that onus was on the South Africans, but in the event he didn't go anyway. Um, so, Ukraine's foreign ministry spokesman, Jorge Tiki, again, my pronunciation may be off, but he said Mongolia has allowed an accused criminal to evade justice. Well, it's hard to see it any other way. Putin is a tyrant that not only keeps the Russian people, under an atmosphere of absolute fear. He has created state terrorism in a sovereign nation, deliberately targeting civilians. I mean, to bomb a children's cancer hospital, as Russia did in July, um, how anyone could look at that and see in any way, shape, or form that Russia has a moral argument, it's beneath. That is about the most evil thing one can imagine. Now, there's just one other aspect of this. Well, a few more things before I round this up. Um, there is risks with this incursion, and I'm not surprised that the West is somewhat cautious about supporting that. Um, I mean, at the time, I thought, is this really sensible because it's using up resources, whereas the focus should be on defending Ukrainian sovereign territory rather than bringing the war to Russia. Although there is something in that. It's giving. I'm tempted to say giving Russia a taste of its own medicine, but that would be a bit crude. Rather, it's forcing Putin to relocate, you know, sources resources to that area. Although, according to local people, Russian troops have abandoned their villages, and ironically, it's the Ukrainians that are distributing supplies. There's one video, if I can find it, I'll link it to this, where Ukrainian troops were talking to locals and having a civil conversation. And the locals could see that they were technically invaders. They went into Russia, but they've been told that the Ukrainians are these marauding Nazis who will kill them in their sleep, and that hasn't happened. Um, yeah, so it may damage the propaganda to some extent. Now there is one thing I want to focus on regarding sports and regarding Russia in the world. There is a strong Ukrainian argument, and this comes from most Ukrainians, from what I gather, that all Russians, should be collectively punished for this. Now, I'm not taken on that. Um, and I say this cautiously because I'm not on the front line. I haven't lost my family to a Russian airstrike. And if I had, maybe I'd have a very dogged black and white view on this. I'm not there, so I can maybe be a bit more objective. You know, Athletes participating in the Olympics and Paralympics from Russia, for me, the question is, do they support Putin or not? Now, if they support Putin, I don't think they should be in the games. I don't think they should be normalized. But if they don't, should they really be collectively punished? I suppose the argument is that Germans were after the war, but was that justified? I mean, there were examples of the mass rape of German women by Soviet troops in 1945. No one, even in Germany, really batted an eye about that because such was the horror of World War II that it was almost like a footnote, although it was a large crime against humanity. But given what Germany had done to Soviet citizens, it was like the mindset of a total war. And I think it's not dissimilar at the moment because this is a total war between Russia and Ukraine. It is literally a battle for survival for the Ukrainians. So I think that Ukrainians do see all Russians as the problem. But here's the thing: there is this disagreement between Ukrainians and Russian dissidents. Russian dissidents will say there is a majority against Putin. I'd like to believe that, but I think that unfortunately they are still in the minority. Alexei Navalny had a lot of support, and no doubt so did other Russian dissidents. But I'd be cautious about saying it's a majority support. As we know, it's very, very difficult to get rid of Putin. Even a neo-nationalist thug like Evgeny Prigozhin found himself dead from trying. So, Putin's untouchable to some extent. On the other hand, he does look like a weakened and desperate tyrant. And it is significant that China hasn't really done more to support Russia. I mean, outwardly they have this strong partnership, and they have an eternal relationship, and all the other rhetoric that's used in meetings between Putin and Xi Jinping. But Russia's very much the junior partner, and history shows, and thinking of the Sino-Soviet split in the 60s, that you can't have two very powerful countries and not have some mistrust, mutual mistrust. even if they are ideologically aligned in opposition to the West. Um, I think Russia will resent being the junior partner, and China, for all its totalitarianism, will be squeamish about the notion that Ukraine is, in fact, a sovereign country that was invaded. Now, they don't see Taiwan the same way, and no doubt they're looking at Ukraine to see what they'll do in Taiwan, but they they weren't going to openly support that, given that they've spent years preaching about sovereignty. Um, Disappointed with Mongolia, but it shouldn't be too surprising. Mongolia has long been in had trade with Russia. But this thing about collective punishment, my concern about it is you end up polarizing Russian dissidents. They're then kind of assaulted by both sides. They're assaulted by Putin's regime because they're locked up and jailed, um, but they're assaulted by Ukrainians as well because they're collectively tarred with the same brush. So I don't think it's the right approach. You know, I have enormous sympathy for Ukrainians, but it I would disagree with anyone who says all Russians are the same. That's it also would just pander into Kremlin propaganda about Russophobia. Fact of the matter is, there are Russians who have taken very real risks, and in some cases paid with their lives. In other cases, spent years languishing in prison. We saw that with the recent prisoner exchange, what those people went through. So I don't agree with Ukrainians who say that all Russians should be treated the same. But then again, I'm not on the front line. I'm not right in the midst of this total war. So I don't know. Maybe it's wrong for me to lecture them on that, but I don't think, I don't think it should be a case of all Russians should be collectively punished. Now, the issue of there is an argument with that, that the only way you break through to the Russian people is by forcing them to wake up to what Putin is. And the only way the argument goes that the only way to do that is if they suffer sanctions personally. But that may only make cause more resentment towards the West. So I'm not sure, but I definitely support making life as difficult as possible for Putin and his cronies. Um, Absolutely. And as for Volodymyr Zelensky, I know there's been internal feuds between Zelensky and some of his generals, but I cannot help but admire Zelensky. I mean, what this man has went through in trying to defend his country. Of course, he's asking for money. Of course, he's asking for support. People, you know, Western Putin apologists make out that this is some sort of money laundering scheme. Any leader in the world in the position that Volodymyr Zelensky is in would do the same thing. They would be doing everything they can to get international support. That's totally legitimate and it's totally understandable. Um, I mean, I think, does this man ever get any sleep? I mean, he must be mentally and physically exhausted, but he persists. Um, I personally cannot help but admire Zelensky. I just think that what he has went through embodies the wider Ukrainian spirit. Of course, there's going to be internal disagreements. That's healthy. Um, Lincoln had disagreements in the American Civil War with his generals. That's what happens in wartime. I'm sure Churchill did, but you contrast the two leaders, it's striking. Anyway, wrap this up.